The air conditioning wheezed against the August heat in Herschel Green's law office, but nothing could cut through the thick tension that settled over the assembled family like morning fog on the Savannah River. Glenn arrived 15 minutes late, still wearing his work clothes, motor oil under his fingernails despite scrubbing them raw in the marina's bathroom sink. He slipped into the last empty chair, avoiding the sideways glances from cousins he saw maybe twice a year at funerals and Christmas dinners. Shane sat in the front row, his pressed khakis and golf shirt making Glenn feel even more out of place. Everything about his half-brother radiated success: the gold watch, the confident posture, the way he nodded at Herschel like they were old friends closing a business deal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Herschel cleared his throat and began reading in his careful, measured voice. The farmhouse on River Road went to Shane. The 40 acres of prime riverfront land went to Shane. The family Bible, the antique furniture, the small fortune in savings, all Shane. Glenn's name appeared exactly once in the entire document, buried in a paragraph about other living relatives, where their grandmother had specified that Glenn Rhee would receive nothing, this being my final word on the matter. The silence stretched like a held breath. Aunt Carol shifted uncomfortably. Uncle Theodore studied his shoes. Glenn felt heat rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but something closer to the dull ache of confirmation. 32 years old, and he was still the family disappointment, officially documented now in legal language. "Well," Shane said, his voice cutting through the quiet, "I suppose that settles things." He stood, shaking Herschel's hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to winning. Glenn rose to leave, but Herschel called out, "Glenn, hold on a minute." The old lawyer shuffled through his papers, pulling out a manila folder. "I always provide copies to family members for their records, no charge." Glenn took the folder, feeling the weight of 30 pages that had just redefined his relationship with the only family he'd ever really known. As he walked to his truck, he heard Shane's voice behind him, talking to someone about renovation plans for the farmhouse, his tone casual and proprietary. Glenn's apartment above Dale's marina smelled like salt air and engine grease, a combination that had become as familiar as breathing. He tossed the folder onto his small kitchen table and started making coffee, his movements automatic while his mind churned. The smart thing would be to pack up, take the mechanic's job in Savannah that Dale's friend had mentioned, start fresh somewhere nobody knew his history. He flipped through the will while waiting for the coffee to brew, not really reading but torturing himself with the formal language that had just written him out of his own family story. The pages felt thick and expensive, the kind of paper that announced its importance. He was turning to the signature page when something fluttered to the floor, a piece of paper yellowed at the edges and brittle like autumn leaves. He picked it up, and his grandmother's handwriting stopped him cold. He'd seen it 1,000 times on birthday cards and grocery lists, but this was different, more careful, more intentional. "Addendum to the last will and testament of Eleanor Ruth Grimes," it began, dated June 15, 2023. His coffee maker gurgled to life, but Glenn barely heard it. The page was brief, maybe 2 paragraphs, but every word hit him like a physical blow. "To my grandson Glenn Rhee, I leave the dock property at Marsh Point Road, including the structure, fishing boat registration number GA77424MB, and all contents therein. This property has been held in trust and is not part of the public record. Glenn is to find the truth before deciding its fate. He will know what this means when the time comes." The signatures were there. His grandmother's shaky script, 2 witnesses Glenn didn't recognize, and a notary seal dated just 3 months before she died. Glenn read it 3 times before setting it down with trembling fingers. Marsh Point Road. He'd lived in this county his entire life and had never heard of it. The boat registration number meant nothing to him. But his grandmother's words, "Find the truth before deciding its fate," felt like a message from beyond the grave, written specifically for him in a voice he'd never heard her use before. For the first time since walking into that law office, Glenn felt something other than resignation stirring in his chest. Herschel Green's office looked different in the morning light, less formal and more like what it was, the workspace of a man who'd been practicing law in the same building for 4 decades. Glenn sat across from the massive oak desk, the mysterious page spread between them like evidence of a crime. "I've never seen this before," Herschel said, adjusting his reading glasses. He held the paper up to his desk lamp, studying the watermark. "But it's authentic. That's your grandmother's handwriting, and I recognize the notary seal. Martha Hendricks, been doing work in this county for 30 years. "Is it legal?" Glenn asked. "That's the million-dollar question." Herschel leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Technically, yes. It's properly witnessed and notarized. But—" He trailed off, tapping his pen against the desk. "But Shane won't see it that way. Shane will fight this with everything he's got. He's been planning that riverfront development for years. If word gets out that there's another heir to any part of the estate, it could tie things up in court for years." Glenn stared at the page, his grandmother's words swimming slightly in the morning light. "The dock property. Do you know where it is?" "Marsh Point Road. It's way out in the salt marsh, maybe 15 miles east of town. Used to belong to your mother's people, the Chamberlains. Your grandmother acquired it after—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "After your mother passed. It's been sitting empty for 20 years as far as I know." "Why would she leave it to me?" Herschel's expression softened slightly. "Eleanor was a complicated woman, Glenn. Hard to read, harder to understand. But she wasn't cruel, despite what some folks thought. Maybe she had her reasons." Glenn folded the page carefully and slipped it back into his jacket. "What would you do?" "Me?" Herschel considered this. "I'd drive out to that dock. See what's there before making any decisions. Sometimes the land tells you things that legal documents can't." As Glenn stood to leave, Herschel called out once more. "Glenn, whatever you decide to do, be careful. There's more history in this county than most people realize, and not all of it has been laid to rest." The road to Marsh Point wasn't really a road at all, just a narrow strip of oyster shell and packed dirt that wound through stands of live oak draped in Spanish moss. Glenn's truck bounced over ruts and potholes, the GPS on his phone useless this far from civilization. He followed the county map Herschel had photocopied for him, turning left at a rusted mailbox, then right where the pavement ended entirely. The dock appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, weathered gray planks stretching maybe 50 feet into the tidal marsh, surrounded by acres of salt grass that whispered in the coastal breeze. At the end of the dock, a small fishing boat bobbed gently on the incoming tide, its white hull faded to the color of old bones. Glenn parked and walked slowly down the dock, his footsteps echoing hollow on the sun-warped boards. The smell hit him first. Salt and mud and something else. Something that reminded him of childhood summers he couldn't quite place. The boat was maybe 20 feet long, an old Carolina skiff with a small outboard motor. Painted on the stern in blue letters so faded they were barely readable was the name Second Chance. He climbed aboard carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The boat was dry inside, protected by a canvas cover that looked newer than everything else. Tucked under one of the bench seats was a metal tackle box, the kind his father used to carry on their rare fishing trips. Inside the box, Glenn found what he'd been looking for without knowing it. Photographs, maybe 24 of them, curled at the edges and faded to sepia tones. His mother, young and laughing,
standing on this same dock. His mother in a sundress, her arm around a tall man with kind eyes. His mother and the same man sitting in this same boat, both of them squinting into the sun. Telling and preparing the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Glenn had seen maybe 5 pictures of his mother in his entire life. His grandmother had never been one for displaying photographs, and his father rarely talked about the woman who died when Glenn was barely walking. But here she was, alive and beautiful and happy, in a place that now belonged to him. He sat in the boat until the sun started to sink, studying each photograph, trying to piece together a story he'd never been told. When he finally climbed back onto the dock, the name Second Chance seemed less faded, as if the failing light had somehow restored its color. The Whitfield County Library closed at 6 on weekdays, but Maggie Green always stayed late to catch up on paperwork. She looked up from her computer when Glenn knocked on the glass doors, and her expression shifted from annoyance to concern when she saw his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, letting him into the quiet building. They sat in her office, surrounded by towers of books waiting to be shelved, while Glenn told her everything: the hidden page, the dock, the photographs of his mother. Maggie listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, but mostly just letting him talk. "Shane's going to lose his mind," she said when he finished. "That's what Herschel said." "Herschel's being diplomatic. I mean, Shane will actually lose his mind. He's been talking about developing that riverfront land since high school, got investors lined up, architectural plans drawn, the whole 9 yards. If there's any question about clear title—" She trailed off, but Glenn heard the unfinished thought. Shane wouldn't just fight this legally, he'd make it personal. "There's something else," Maggie said, pulling a manila folder from her desk drawer. "I did some digging after you left yesterday. Old newspaper archives, property records, that kind of thing." She opened the folder, revealing photocopied pages from the Savannah Morning News dating back to the 1990s. Your grandmother wasn't the only one with secrets. The headline on the top clipping made Glenn's breath catch. "Local man dies in boating accident off Marsh Point." The accompanying photograph showed a familiar face, the same man from the pictures in the tackle box, the one who'd been standing next to his mother. His name was David Chamberlain, your mother's cousin. They were— She hesitated. "They were what?" "Engaged, according to the obituary anyway. He died 2 weeks before their wedding." Glenn stared at the newspaper clipping, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The dock, the boat, the photographs of his mother, and his grandmother who'd spent 20 years keeping this part of his mother's story locked away like a secret too dangerous to tell. "Glenn," Maggie said, her voice gentle but firm, "whatever you're thinking about doing, you need to be careful. This isn't just about property or money anymore. This is about family history that somebody worked very hard to bury." Outside the windows, the sun was setting over Savannah, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Glenn folded the newspaper clipping and slipped it into his pocket next to his grandmother's hidden page. "I know," he said, "but maybe it's time some things came to light."
Dale Horvath had been running boats longer than Glenn had been alive, his weathered hands and sun-beaten face testament to decades spent on the water. He looked up from the engine he was rebuilding when Glenn approached, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "You look troubled, son," Dale said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize when it was weighing heavy on a person. Glenn pulled out the photographs, spreading them across Dale's workbench. "Did you know him, David Chamberlain?" Dale's expression shifted, something guarded settling over his features. He picked up one of the photos, studying it carefully. "I knew him. Good man. Your mother loved him something fierce." He set the photo down gently. "What's this about, Glenn?" "My grandmother left me his dock and his boat. I'm trying to understand why." Dale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Glenn's mother laughing in David's arms. "Your grandmother blamed David for what happened to your mother.
Said he filled her head with dreams of leaving, of making a life somewhere else. When he died in that accident, he shook his head. Eleanor never forgave herself for the things she said to your mother about him. What kind of things? The kind that drive a wedge between people who love each other. Your mother stopped coming around much after David died, moved to Atlanta, met your father. When she passed having you, Dale's voice trailed off. Glenn felt something cold settle in his stomach. My grandmother blamed me too, didn't she? Not blamed, exactly, but she saw you as the end of a story that should have had a different ending. Your mother should have married David, should have stayed here, should have lived. Dale's eyes were kind but unflinching. Eleanor spent 20 years carrying that guilt. Maybe leaving you that dock was her way of trying to make amends. Shane doesn't see it that way. Shane sees everything as his by right. Always has. Dale leaned against his workbench. But let me ask you something, son. What do you see when you look at that dock? Glenn thought about the weathered planks, the boat bobbing in the tidal current, the photographs of his mother's happiness. I see a place where my mother was loved. Really loved. Then maybe that's worth fighting for. Glenn was loading supplies into his truck outside the marine hardware store when Shane's BMW pulled up, blocking him in. His half-brother climbed out, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "We need to talk," Shane said, his voice carrying the edge it had always had when they were kids and he was about to assert his dominance. "I'm listening." "People are saying you've been sniffing around some property out in the marsh. Property that doesn't belong to you." Shane stepped closer, using his height advantage the way he always had. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it stops now." Glenn continued loading his truck, refusing to be intimidated. "Not playing any game, Shane." "The hell you aren't. You think I don't know what this is about? You're pissed about the will, so you're trying to find some way to get back at me? Well, let me make something clear. Everything Grandma left me is mine, fair and square. You try to contest that will, and I'll bury you in legal bills you can't afford." Something in Glenn's chest tightened, but not with fear, with clarity. "You know what's funny, Shane? All these years I thought I was the problem, the disappointment, the one who didn't measure up. But looking at you right now, scared that someone might take away what you think you deserve, I'm starting to realize something." "What's that?" "Maybe the problem was never me at all." Shane's face flushed red. "You always were a sanctimonious little—" "I'm not doing this with you," Glenn said, climbing into his truck. "But here's some free advice. You might want to make sure you actually own everything you think you do before you start making threats."
He drove away without looking back, but he could see Shane in his rearview mirror, standing in the parking lot with his hands clenched into fists. The manila envelope Beth handed Glenn contained more than just letters. Tucked between the pages of his grandmother's correspondence was a newspaper clipping from 1995, yellowed and fragile, with a headline that made Glenn's blood run cold. "Tragic accident claims life of local man. Questions remain unanswered." Glenn sat in Maggie's kitchen while she made coffee, the documents spread across her table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had been missing for 27 years. The official police report was brief. David Chamberlain, experienced boater, found dead near his capsized vessel on a calm evening. Cause of death? Drowning. Case closed within 2 weeks. But the letters told a different story entirely. "I should have been stronger," his grandmother had written in a letter dated just months before her death. "I should have stood up to them, should have defended David when the others in the family said he wasn't good enough for Margaret. Instead, I let them poison her mind against him, let them make her choose between her family and her heart." Maggie set down her coffee cup carefully. What others? What family? Glenn flipped through more letters, finding pieces of the puzzle scattered across years of his grandmother's guilt-ridden correspondence. The Chamberlains had been tenant farmers on land owned by the Grimes family for 3 generations. David's father had worked the same fields Glenn's great-grandfather had owned. When David and Margaret fell in love, the class difference became a source of bitter conflict within both families. They said he was reaching above his station, another letter revealed. Said Margaret was being foolish, that she'd throw away her future for a boy who'd never amount to anything. I watched her grow sadder each day, torn between love and duty. When David died, I knew we'd killed something in her too. Beth appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "There's more," she said quietly. "I found this in Grandma's jewelry box." She handed Glenn a small leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age. Glenn opened it carefully. The entries were in his mother's handwriting, documenting the final weeks of her relationship with David. The words painted a picture of a young woman caught between 2 worlds, pressured by her family to end an engagement they saw as beneath her. "David asked me again today if I trusted him more than I trusted them. I couldn't answer. God help me, I couldn't answer him. I saw the look in his eyes when I hesitated, saw something break inside him. How do you choose between the family that raised you and the man you love?" The final entry was dated the day before David's death. He said if I couldn't choose him over their disapproval, then maybe I'd already made my choice. He was wrong, but I was too proud to tell him so. Tomorrow I'm going to the dock to tell him I choose us. I choose love over fear. But tomorrow had been too late. David was already gone, leaving behind a grieving fiancée who would spend the rest of her short life believing she'd driven away the only man who'd ever truly loved her. Glenn closed the diary, his hands shaking. His mother had died in childbirth, carrying not just him, but the weight of guilt over David's death. His grandmother had carried that same guilt for 27 years, watching it poison her relationship with the grandson who reminded her daily of the daughter she had failed to protect. "She left you the dock because it was where your mother was happiest," Maggie said softly. "Before the family got involved, before the pressure and the expectations. It was the one place where your mother could just be herself."
Glenn thought about the photographs in the tackle box, his mother's radiant smile as she stood beside David on that very dock. For the first time, he understood what his grandmother's cryptic note had meant: find the truth before deciding its fate. The truth wasn't just about property or legal documents. It was about understanding the cost of family expectations, the price of choosing approval over authenticity. "What are you going to do?" Beth asked. Glenn looked at his cousin, seeing for the first time not Shane's sister, but a woman who'd spent her own life walking the careful line between family loyalty and personal truth. "I'm going to finish what David and my mother started. I'm going to stop letting other people's fears define my choices." The restoration of the dock began at first light on a Tuesday morning in September. Glenn arrived with a truck full of pressure-treated lumber, marine-grade hardware, and a determination that felt like armor against the whispers that would inevitably follow. Dale showed up an hour later without being asked, followed by 2 other men from the marina whose names Glenn barely knew, but whose presence said everything about the quiet alliances that formed in small communities. They worked in comfortable silence, replacing the rotted boards one by one, the rhythmic sound of hammers echoing across the marsh. Glenn found himself thinking about his mother as he worked, imagining her young and hopeful, standing on these same planks with David, planning a future that would never come to pass. By noon, cars had begun stopping along the narrow road, their occupants watching from a respectful distance. Some were curious neighbors. Others were family members Glenn recognized from the will reading, their expressions ranging from puzzled to disapproving. But none of them approached as if the dock existed in its own sovereignty, separate from the politics of the mainland. Shane arrived just after lunch, his BMW kicking up dust on the Shell Road. He stood at the beginning of the dock for nearly 10 minutes, his posture rigid with controlled fury, before finally walking out to where Glenn was working. "This is insane," Shane said, his voice tight. "You can't just show up and claim property that's been in legal limbo for 20 years. Glenn didn't look up from the board he was securing. "According to the county clerk, I can. Herschel filed the paperwork yesterday morning. It's all legal and binding. I'll contest it. I'll hire lawyers, tie this up in court for years. You don't have the money to fight me." Glenn straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. For 32 years, Shane's threats would have sent him retreating. But something had shifted in the past week, some fundamental understanding of his own worth that no amount of legal maneuvering could touch. "You do what you think you need to do," Glenn said calmly, "but I'll be here either way. This dock is going to stand." Shane's face flushed red. "You think this is about the dock? This is about you trying to get back at me for everything you think I took from you? Well, let me tell you something." "Shane." Beth's voice cut through her brother's tirade like a blade. She stood at the end of the dock, holding another manila envelope. "Stop." "Beth, don't—" "She was tired of keeping secrets to protect your feelings," she said, walking past Shane to hand Glenn the envelope. "These are the rest of Grandma's letters, the ones she wrote but never sent, about David, about what really happened, about why she blamed herself." Shane's expression shifted from anger to something closer to panic. "You don't know what you're doing. Some things are better left buried." "Like the truth about why David Chamberlain really died?" Beth's voice was quiet but unwavering. "Like the fact that our family drove him to it with their prejudice and their pride?"
The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of water lapping against the dock pilings. Glenn could see the exact moment when Shane understood that the narrative he'd built his life around, the story of rightful inheritance and natural superiority, was about to crumble. "He was going to drag our family down," Shane said finally, his voice defensive. "He had no education, no prospects. Grandma was protecting Margaret from making a mistake that would have ruined her life." "Instead, she made a mistake that ended it," Glenn replied, "and spent 27 years trying to live with the guilt." As the sun began to set over the marsh, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Glenn continued working. Shane eventually left, his departure marked by the angry roar of his BMW engine and a cloud of dust that settled slowly over the marsh grass. But Beth remained, sitting quietly on the restored section of dock, watching her cousin reclaim something that had been lost long before either of them was born. Glenn stood alone on the dock at sunrise, watching the tide change direction in the salt marsh channels. The Second Chance bobbed gently beside him, her hull gleaming white in the morning light, her engine purring with the quiet satisfaction of machinery restored to purpose. In his pocket were his grandmother's final letters, including one dated just days before her death that contained the words he'd waited 32 years to hear. "You were never the disappointment, Glenn. I was. I let fear and pride rob our family of love, and I've spent every day since paying the price. The dock is yours not because you need property, but because you need to know that someone saw your worth, even if she was too stubborn to say so while she lived." His phone buzzed with a text from the real estate agent in Savannah. The mechanic's position was still available. Good pay, benefits, a chance to start over in a city where nobody knew his history. All he had to do was say yes. But as Glenn started the boat's engine and eased away from the dock, he realized that starting over and moving forward weren't the same thing. He'd spent his entire life running from a family that didn't value him, only to discover that the problem had never been his worth, it had been their inability to see it. The Second Chance cut through the calm water, carrying Glenn toward the mouth of the creek where it opened into the Sound. Behind him, the dock stood solid and weathered, no longer a symbol of what he'd been denied, but of what he'd chosen to claim. The morning sun caught the water droplets kicked up by the boat's wake, each one sparkling like a small promise before falling back into the marsh. Glenn thought about David Chamberlain, A young man who died believing he wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy of love, wasn't strong enough to fight the expectations of others. He thought about his mother, trapped between love and duty until the choice was taken from her forever. And he thought about his grandmother, carrying decades of guilt over words that couldn't be unsaid, choices that couldn't be unmade. But mostly, he thought about the horizon ahead, vast and open and full of possibility. For the first time in his life, Glenn understood that the choice wasn't between staying or leaving, between fighting or surrendering. The choice was simpler and more profound: to live as the person he actually was, rather than the person others expected him to be. As the boat reached the open water, Glenn turned back toward shore, toward the dock that was now truly his, toward a future he would build one plank at a time. The second chance had earned her name, and so had he.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.